So today we'll discuss about the cranial cavity. So like the other cavities in the body, abdominal cavity, pelvic cavity, thoracic cavity. So you have cavity in the head, that is a cranial cavity. So we have two bony components in the cranial cavity, that is the vault, which is more or less uniform, and the base of the skull, which is made up of three descending steps or three terraces. We will see what is that. And the contents of the cavity are the brain, the main structure, which is covered with the meninges, and the cerebrospinal fluid, the blood vessels, the intracranial part of the cranial nerves. So this is a whole skull, which is made up of 22 bones. Yes. So on this picture will give you an idea of the different bones in the skull. So you have 22 bones, out of which the 8 form the bones of calvaria, and the remaining 18 form the facial skeleton. So out of the 8 bones, you have 2 paired bones, that is, you have parietal and temporal, or the paired bones, and the unpaired bones are, you have the sphenoid, you have this ethmoid here, and then occipital and frontal. Okay, so these are the 8 bones which form the bones of the calvaria. This is a vault of the skull. So the interior of the vault. So this vault is made up of 3 bones. That is a frontal bone in the front. This is a frontal bone. This is the parietal, and this is the occipital bone. So what are the features you see there? So you see the sagittal suture in the midline. Yes, so this is a sagittal suture in the midline. So and then you see the you have this groove for the superior sagittal sinus within that, and on either side this is the lips for the attachment of falx cerebri. So we will see what is the falx cerebri. Then this between the frontal and the parietal bone, you have this coronal suture there, and this is the occipital bone, which is blue color, and you have see the suture, that is the lambda shaped suture, that is the lambdoid suture. And you see some structures there, that is some markings there. So these are the impressions that are produced by the posterior branches of middle meningeal artery. So the middle meningeal artery is a branch from the maxillary artery which supplies this meninges and the cranial cavity. So it's a main source. So you see the impressions produced by these branches, that is the posterior branches of middle meningeal artery in the parietal bone, and you have this anterior branch of middle meningeal artery in the frontal bone. And you see some more depressions here, so that you call it as granula foveae. Okay, so that is granula foveae. So these are produced by the arachnoid granulations that produces impression in this vault, so that is called as granula foveae. So this is the base of the skull, where you see the this base comparing to the vault, which is a uniform, more or less uniform structure. This base is not uniform. Yes, you have elevations, or you can compare it with 3 descending steps from top to bottom. Yes, from frontal. So this is the anterior cranial fossa, this is a middle cranial fossa, and this is a posterior cranial fossa. So you can compare with this terraces or 3 descending steps. Okay, so this posterior cranial fossa considered to be the ground floor, and this first and the middle is the first floor, and you compare this anterior cranial fossa to the second floor. So this base of the skull is not uniform. So you have it's compared to the, or you have 3 descending steps in this base of the cranial. we discussed as we discussed about the contents of the cranial cavity, is the brain adult with meninges. So we'll see the meninges. So as you all know, the meninges is made up of three layers. You have outer dura, otherwise called as patch meninx, and middle arachnoid. Arachnoid means a web like, so as it looks like a web, it is named as arachnoid. And the innermost layer, which is the pia mater. So the arachnoid and the pia together called as leptomeninges. So you have three layers, and you have three spaces related to these three layers. So the first is the extradural or the epidural space. So that is the potential space between the dura and the adjacent bone. So the hemorrhage which occurs in this area in pathological conditions, you call it as extradural hemorrhage, and that is due to rupture of the meningeal vessels. And the next space between the dura and the arachnoid is the subdural. Sub means below, says below the dura. So that is the subdural space. So hemorrhage can too occur in this space, that is a subdural hemorrhage, that is due to rupture of the superior cerebral veins which pass through this space, that is a subdural hemorrhage. And the subarachnoid space, that is between the arachnoid and the pia. So you have the important structure, that is a cerebrospinal fluid that flows through this, circulates through this subarachnoid space in the cranial cavity. So here too you can have a hemorrhage, and that is due to rupture of the cerebral arteries or the branches at the base of the brain. So we'll see about the cranial dura in detail. Yes, this cranial dura, so it is and the peculiarity of this cranial dura is you have two layers in the cranial dura. You have the outer endosteal layer and the inner meningeal layer. So the endosteal layer is attached, intimately related to the endocranium of the cranial bones, and it is continuous with the pericranium at the foramina. So it is continuous with the pericranium at the foramen, all the foramina, and also to the foramen magna. And you have this branches of the middle meningeal artery and the veins, so which ascend on the external surface of this endosteal layer. Okay, so that's about the endosteal layer. So the cranial dura has a peculiarity is that it's made up of two layers, outer endosteal and inner meningeal layer. So the outer endosteal layer is actually the endocranium of the cranial bones. It is continuous with the pericranium and the foramina, and it is continuous with the pericranium and the foramen magnum too. And the branches of the middle meningeal artery and the veins ascend on this external surface. Okay, so coming to the next layer, that is the meningeal layer. So this meningeal layer is continuous with the spinal dura at the foramen magnum. Okay, so this meningeal layer is continuous with the spinal dura at the foramen magnum. So this meningeal layer, it duplicates itself, duplicates itself to form the dural folds. So that is the main topic of discussion in this cranial cavity. So we'll see what is dural folds. So this the inner meningeal layer is duplicated to form the dural folds, and within the dural folds you have the important structure, that is the dural venous sinuses. Okay, so this endosteal layer and the meningeal layer are adherent to each other. You can't separate these two layers apart, except where it is except in the places where you have dural venous folds, and also dural venous sinuses and dural venous folds. So this endosteal and meningeal layer are adherent to each other, except where the dural venous sinuses are present and where the dural folds are present. Okay, so the main thing we will see this dural folds. So I told you already, the dural folds are nothing but the reduplication of its inner meningeal layer. Okay, so this you have 4 dural folds, that is the falx cerebri. So this is the falx cerebri, and this is the tentorium cerebelli, and here you have the falx cerebelli, and here you have this diaphragma sella. So you have the dural folds, 4 dural folds, falx cerebelli, tentorium cerebelli, and diaphragm macella. Okay, so what is the function of this dural folds? So why the inner meningeal layer is duplicated to form the dural folds here? So it helps in stabilizing the brain during movements of the head. Okay, so it stabilizes the brain during movement of the head. So if these dural folds are not present, what happens now? The brain in the skull exerts pressure on the strain on the thin walled veins that pass through the subdural space, and it leads to rupture of these veins. So that's why you have the dural folds. So the function of the dural folds is to help in stabilizing the brain during movement of the head. So in order to prevent injury to the veins, thin walled veins that pass through the subdural space. So that is the function of this dural folds. So we'll see what this dural folds one by one. So before going to this this dural folds, so we have to know some important bony landmarks in the base of the skull. Okay, so this picture is what you see here is the anterior cranial fossa. So we'll see the important features in the anterior cranial fossa. Yes, so I told you this base, you have 3 descending strips in the base. So anterior, middle, and posterior cranial fossa. So we'll see the features of the anterior cranial fossa. So you see this crest. So in the midline you see a structure located in the midline, that is the frontal crest. And then immediately posterior to that you see the projection, that is the crista galli. So that is the crista galli here. Okay, so here you see this cribriform plate of ethmoid lines in the midline in the floor. So this is the green color structure is a cribriform plate of ethmoid. So the cribriform plate of ethmoid is pierced by the 15 to 20 filaments of olfactory nerves. As the olfactory nerves enter the cranial cavity by piercing this cribriform plate of ethmoid. So on the lateral side, this floor is formed by this floor of the anterior cranial fossa is formed by the orbital part of the frontal bone. Okay, so that is the orbital part of the frontal bone which forms the floor of the anterior cranial fossa. So at the junction of this frontal crest and the crista galli, you have this foramen cecum. So this foramen occasionally transmits emissary vein. So we'll see the importance in later when you read about the dural venous sinuses. And posteriorly you see this body of the sphenoid. So this is the body of the sphenoid in the midline. On either side you have this lesser ring of sphenoid. So this are the features that you see in the anterior cranial fossa. So you have one more structure, that is the anterior clinoid process. So that is the medial end of is present in the medial end of the posterior margin of lesser wing of sphenoid. So this is present in the medial end of posterior margin of lesser wing of sphenoid. So that is the anterior clinoid process. You have projection from them. That is the anterior clinoid process. So these are the features that you see in the anterior cranial fossa. Okay, so you have this mainly in this anterior cranial fossa you see the frontal bone, ethmoidal and sphenoidal. So the orbital part of the frontal bone forms the floor of anterior cranial fossa on either side. In the midline you see an elevation, that is a frontal crest in anteriorly, and you have an posteriorly you can see a projection, that is a crista galli. So between the frontal crest and the crista galli you see a foramen, that is foramen cecum. So you see the cribriform plate of ethmoid in the midline. So you have cribri means sieve-like, sieve-like. So you have some 18 to 20 openings, small minute openings there, which transmit the olfactory rootlets. And then posteriorly you have this body of sphenoid in the midline. On either side it is bounded by the lesser wing of sphenoid, and you see the anterior clinoid process. That's the medial end of the posterior margin of the lesser wing of sphenoid. So these are the features that you see in the So coming to the middle cranial fossa, so we see what are the features that you see in the middle cranial fossa. So the middle cranial fossa is at a lower level when compared to the anterior cranial fossa. So you have this yellow color is the sphenoid bone, and this green color is the parietal, and then you have this green color is, so this yellow color is the sphenoid, green color is the temporal, and this gray color is the parietal bone. So these are the bones that form the middle cranial fossa. Okay, sphenoid, temporal, and the parietal bone. So this is a parietal, this is temporal, and this is sphenoid. Okay, so we'll see what are the features there in the middle cranial fossa. So you see anteriorly in the midline, you see a groove that you call it as chiasmaticus sulcus or sulcus chiasmaticus. So that leads to the optic canals that is placed just behind the body of the sphenoid. So you see body of the sphenoid in the anterior cranial fossa. Just behind that, in the middle cranial fossa, you see the sulcus chiasmaticus, which leads to the optic canal, and it is placed just behind the body of the sphenoid. Okay, and then behind that, so you have this body of the sphenoid. So it is located in the median part of the fossa. So you have this entire structure, you call it as sella tertica. Okay, so this structure you call it as sella tertica. Sella tertica means Turkish saddle. Saddle. So the saddle in the Turkey, it's shaped like that. So you have this central depression, that is the hypophyseal fossa. So you have an elevation on either side. Anteriorly you call it as tuberum sella. Posteriorly you call this elevation as the dorsum sella. Okay, so that is a that is situated in the midline. Okay, then you have this this is the greater wing of sphenoid on the either side. This is the greater wing of sphenoid, and you have various foramen there in the greater wing of sphenoid. Yes, so between the greater wing and the lesser wing you have this superior orbital fissure, and then so you have this foramen lacerum here, foramen so foramen lacerum there, through which the internal carotid artery enters the base of the brain, and you have this foramen rotundum, that is there. This is foramen ovale, and this is foramen spinosum, and this foramen is the foramen spinosum. So foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, and foramen spinosum. So these foramen are situated in the greater wing of sphenoid. Okay, so on this so that is present in the midline. That is the greater wing of sphenoid, either side of body of sphenoid. Then you have this petrous part of the temporal bone. So this structure is the petrous part of the temporal bone. Petrous means stony hard. So okay, so this part of temporal bone is the petrous part. So petrous means stony hard. So when you compare, when you touch and see this petrous, it is somewhat hard when compared to the remaining part of the temporal bone. So that is, this is the squamous part of the temporal bone. So this is the petrous part of the temporal bone. Then you see this squamous part of the temporal bone on either side. So and above that it is bounded by this parietal bone. So these are the features that you see in the middle cranial fossa. So and then so this is the hypophyseal fossa in the center. Yes, that's lodged the pituitary gland. So the center is the sella tertica, that is the Turkish saddle, which is hollowed in the center, that is formed by the hypophyseal fossa. So tuberum sella in the front and the dorsum sella behind, and the dorsum sella laterally, when you trace, you can see a process, that is the posterior clinoid process. So that's certain the fox is that is one of the dural fold is attached to the posterior cranial posterior clinoid process. So that's about the middle cranial fossa. Yes, so these are the bones. So you have the sphenoid, body of sphenoid, and greater wing of sphenoid, which forms the boundary there, part of the middle cranial fossa. And you have the temporal bone, which is in green color. So the petrous temporal bone, petrous part of the temporal bone, and the squamous part of the temporal bone forms the part, and a small part of the parietal bone that forms the boundary of this middle cranial fossa. So coming to this posterior cranial fossa. So this posterior cranial fossa is very large in compared to the other two fossa. So, and it's deep too. So this anterior wall of the fossa is formed by this clivus. So anterior wall of this fossa, posterior cranial fossa, is formed by the clivus. So which is a sloping surface. It is formed by the union of basilar part of the occipital bone and the body of the sphenoid. Okay, so that is the clivus in the midline. So this clivus is the sloping surface that is formed by the fusion of the basilar part of the occipital bone and the body of the sphenoid. So you have this medulla oblongata and pons of the brain, which is in direct contact with this clivus. So the medulla and the pons is in direct contact with this clivus. So you have this behind the clivus, you see a large foramen. Its magnum is larger, so that is the foramen magnum. As you are familiar with the structure passing through the foramen magnum is, so the medulla continues as a spinal cord along with the meninges, and you have the blood vessels that leaves the foramen magnum. And then you have this behind the foramen magnum, you see a midline crest. So this is the midline crest, that is the internal occipital crest. So that is the internal occipital crest. So at the upper end of the internal occipital crest, you see a protuberance, that you call it as the internal occipital protuberance. So internal occipital protuberance is an important landmark for the dural venous sinuses and the dural venous folds. So you have the three dural folds, that is the falx cerebri, falx cerebellae, and tentorium cerebellae. The three dural folds meet in this site, that is the internal occipital protuberance. So this internal occipital protuberance is indicated on the external surface by the we'll see the attachment of falx cerebri. So falx, it derives its name being sickle. So this falx forms a vertical partition in the longitudinal fissure between the cerebral hemispheres. So this side you have one cerebral hemisphere, and that side you have a cerebral hemisphere. So it forms a vertical partition in the longitudinal fissure between the two hemispheres. So we'll see the attachments. So anteriorly it is attached to this frontal crest of frontal bone and the crista galli of the ethmoid bone. So what we saw in the anterior cranial fossa. Yes, superiorly, so this is the superior attachment of falx cerebri. Superiorly it is attached in the midline of the vault as far as to the internal occipital protuberance. So this is the inferior margin. So inferior margin, it is free anteriorly. Posteriorly it is attached to this tentorium cerebellae. Okay, so that's the attachment of falx cerebri. So anteriorly it is attached to the frontal crest of the frontal bone and the crista galli of the ethmoidal bone. Superiorly it is attached to the midline of the vault as far as the internal occipital protuberance. Inferiorly it is free. Anteriorly, posteriorly it is attached to the tentorium cerebellae. So this is the attached margin of falx cerebri, and this is the free margin of the falx cerebri. So we'll see the dural venous sinuses related to this falx cerebri. So we have three dural venous sinuses related to the falx cerebri. So this is the superior sagittal sinus, which is attached, which is in the attached margin of the falx cerebri, which is lodged in the attached margin of falx cerebri. And this is the inferior sagittal sinus, which is lodged in the free margin of the falx cerebri. And here you have the straight sinus. So that is in the located in the junction between the falx cerebri and the tentorium cerebelli. So these are the venous sinuses that are related to the falx cerebri. Just now I told you, superior sagittal sinus attached to the superior margin or the attached margin, inferior sagittal sinus related to the free margin, and straight sinus along the line of attachment of falx cerebri and the tentorium cerebelli. So this is what I told you. So the falx cerebri is a sickle shaped. That's a vertical partition, the longitudinal fissure between cerebral hemispheres, and these are the attachments of the falx cerebri. Cerebellar fossa, where the cerebellum is launched, and above this tentorium cerebelli you have this occipital lobe of cerebrum. So this tentorium cerebelli, it takes the weight of cerebrum of the cerebellum, so it prevents the compression of cerebellum by this occipital lobe of cerebrum. So like the falx cerebri where you have the attached margin and the free margin, here too you have the attached margin and the free margin. So this is the free margin. So this is the free margin. So that encircles the opening called tentorial notch. So this gap we call it as the tentorial notch, and the remaining is the attached margin. So we will see the attachment of this tentorium cerebelli. So it is attached peripherally to this. So we saw this posterior clinoid process there. So it is attached to the posterior clinoid process and through the superior margin of the petrous temporal bone and the internal surface of the occipital bone. So it is attached to the posterior clinoid process here, superior margin of the petrous temporal bone and to the occipital bone and the internal surface of the occipital bone. So that is the attachment of this tentorium cerebelli. So that is the attached margin that is located peripherally, and centrally you have this free margin which is encircles an opening called tentorial notch. So this I explained you. So you have the free margin, so that encircles the opening called the tentorial notch, and you have the attached margin which is attached to posterior clinoid process, superior margin of the petrous temporal bone and to the internal occipital protuberance. So this attached margin is attached to the inferior margin of the falx cerebri in the midline. Okay, so coming to the dural venous sinuses related to this tentorium cerebelli. Again, here you have the dural venous sinuses. Yes, we saw this straight sinus which is related to this the junction of the falx cerebri and the tentorium cerebelli. You have. So this is the cadaveric specimen to show this tentorium cerebelli and the tentorial notch too. So we will see the sinuses first, that is related to the tentorial cerebelli. So you have three dural sinuses related to this. So this is a superior margin of the petrous temporal bone, where you have this superior petrosal sinus is related there, and you have this groove for this transverse sinus. Yes, groove for the transverse sinus. So we saw this in the posterior cranial fossa. So here the transverse sinus is lodged, and you have the straight sinus. So where you have this the junction of the falx cerebri and the tentorium cerebelli, you have this straight sinus is lodged. So these are the three dural venous sinuses that is related to the tentorium cerebelli. Yes, so the superior petral sinus here, the transverse sinus here, and this straight sinus here. So these are the three dural venous sinuses that are related to the tentorium cerebelli. So coming to this tentorial notch. So this tentorial notch is a U-shaped structure. Yes? So this opening you call it as a tentorial notch, that is U-shaped, So it gives passage for the passage of midbrain oculomotor nerves. So you can see this oculomotor nerves and the posterior cerebral arteries. So these are the three structures that pass through this tentorial notch. That is the midbrain. So in the midbrain, the oculomotor nerve and the posterior cerebral arteries pass through this tentorial notch. So this obstruction of this subarachnoid space in this tentorial notch at this level can result in communicating hydrocephalus. Okay, this thing you have to keep in mind. So the tentorial notch is an U-shaped structure that ends here. So it gives a passage for the midbrain oculomotor nerves and the posterior cerebral arteries. The obstruction of the subarachnoid space in this level, at this level, can result in communicating hydrocephalus. Yes, and I told you these are the three dural venous sinuses that is related to the tentorium cerebelli. So that is a superior petersal sinus that is lodged at the superior margin of the petrous temporal bone, and the transverse sinus that is lodged in the groove for the transverse sinus, and the straight sinus along its attachment to the falx cerebelli. So coming to the next dural fold, that is the diaphragm macella. So it is a circular fold. Yes, so that's a circular fold. It roofs the hypophyseal fossa. So it roofs the. So the diaphragm macella is a circular fold that roofs the hypophyseal fossa that is pierced by the pituitary infundibulum. So that the pituitary stalk pierces and comes out. Yes, so I hope you remember the middle cranial fossa where you saw this sella turcica. So you have a depression in the middle, that is the hypophyseal fossa where the pituitary is lodged, and you have this tuberum sella and elevation, that is tuberum sella in the front and the dorsum sella behind. So that is the attachment of this. Yes, so this is this I taught you know. So this is the sella turcica in the midline. So this is the hypophyseal fossa where the pituitary is lodged. So anteriorly you have this tuberum sella and elevation, posteriorly the tuberum sella. So this diaphragm macella is a circular dural fold. So it is attached like this, the circular dural fold. So that is attached anteriorly to the tuberum sella and posteriorly to the dorsum sella, and below that, that is behind that, you have this hypophyseal fossa where you have the pituitary gland, and this pituitary gland, the stack of the pituitary gland pierces and comes out through this circular dural fold, that is the diaphragm macella. Yes. So what are the dural venous sinuses related to this? So you have the anterior and the posterior intercavernous sinuses. So these two are unpaired dural venous sinuses that is related to this diaphragm macella. So you have this anterior and posterior intercavernous sinuses that is related to this circular dural fold, that is diaphragm macella. So this picture will give you this the location of this pituitary gland and in the hypophyseal fossa. This is pierced. So this is the stack of the pituitary. So the circular dural fold you have here is the diaphragm macella, and this stack pierces and comes out through this diaphragm macella. And you have this the last one, that is a falx cerebelli. So falx cerebelli, so it is again a sickle shaped. So that lies in the posterior cranial fossa. So that lies in the posterior cranial fossa. So it is attached to the so you have this tentorium cerebelli here, right? So this is the tentorium cerebelli. So it's attached to this inferior surface of the tentorium cerebelli and to the internal occipital crest. So this is the attachment of the falx cerebelli. So like this. So again sickle shaped. So it lies in the falx cerebelli, lies in the posterior cranial fossa. It is attached to the inferior surface of tentorium cerebelli and to the internal occipital crest, and the sinus lodged here is the occipital sinus. So the sinus lodged is the occipital sinus. So that's about the dural folds. So the dural folds, you have 4 dural folds. So you have 4 dural folds. So the sickle shaped falx cerebri, and a circular dural fold, that is the diaphragm sella. So this is the diaphragm sella, and tent shaped tentorium cerebelli, and this again a sickle shaped falx cerebelli. So these are the 4 dural folds we discussed so far. Yes, falx cerebri sickle shape, falx cerebelli is again sickle shape, tentorium cerebelli is a tent shape, that is. So you can very well appreciate the tentorial notch in the center. Yes, so this is the attachment of tentorium cerebelli. So you can very well see the attachment here. Yes, better appreciated here. So this is the posterior clinoid process, superior margin of the petrous temporal bone, and the groove for the transverse sulcus. So, and this is a junction of falx cerebri to the tentorium cerebelli. Okay, so and you see a circular dural fold, that is diaphragm sella, that is pierced, that is attached anteriorly to the tuberum sella here, posteriorly to the dorsum sella, and it is pierced by this infundibulum of the pit. So we'll see the blood supply of the cranial cavity. So this anterior cranial fossa, it's supplied by the so this anterior cranial fossa is supplied by this middle branches of the middle meningeal arteries and the posterior ethmoidal arteries. So the posterior ethmoidal arteries. So you have this ethmoidal arteries. So the anterior cranial fossa is supplied by the branches of middle meningeal artery and the posterior ethmoidal arteries. So and the middle cranial fossa is supplied by this middle meningeal artery. See the middle meningeal artery, so which is a branch of the second part of the maxillary artery. So it enters the skull via the foramen, and it supplies the cranial cavity. So the main blood vessel that supplies the cranial cavity and the meninges is the middle meningeal artery. So the branches of the middle meningeal artery to supply the middle cranial fossa, along with the ascending pharyngeal artery. So you have this ascending pharyngeal artery and the accessory meningeal artery. So the middle meningeal artery, ascending pharyngeal and accessory meningeal arteries, along with the branches from the internal carotid artery and the recurrent branch of lacrimal artery. So all these supply the middle cranial fossa. So coming to the posterior cranial fossa, again the branches from the occipital. So you have this occipital artery, branches from the occipital artery, and the branches from the ascending pharyngeal artery, and the branches from the vertebral artery. So these three supply the posterior cranial fossa. Okay, so the anterior cranial fossa, you have branches from middle meningeal artery, and the anterior ethmoidal arteries supply the anterior cranial fossa. So middle cranial fossa, the branches from the middle meningeal artery, accessory middle meningeal artery, then ascending pharyngeal artery, and then the direct branches from the internal carotid artery and the recurrent branch of lacrimal artery. So these 5 supply the middle cranial fossa. The posterior cranial fossa, you have the tics from the occipital artery, vertebral artery, and the meningeal branch of the ascending pharyngeal. So the ascending pharyngeal gives nutrition to both the middle and the posterior cranial fossa. So this picture shows you the innervation, that is the nerve supply of the cranial fossa. So you have this ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve. So that is that innervates the anterior cranial fossa. So along with the sensory tics from anterior and posterior ethmoidal nerves, and the filaments of the meningeal branches of maxillary and mandibular division 2. Okay, so the ethmoidal, anterior and posterior ethmoidal in ophthalmic division, and the filaments of meningeal branches from maxillary and mandibular division 2 supply this anterior cranial fossa. So coming to the middle cranial fossa, so sensory tricks from nervus spinosus, that is the meningeal branch of the mandibular nerve. So the meningeal branch of the mandibular nerve, that is the nervus spinosus, and the meningeal branches from this maxillary, and the direct branch from the maxillary mandibular, and also a direct branch from the trigeminal ganglion to supply this middle cranial fossa. So this middle cranial fossa, you have it's innervated by sensory tracts from the nervus spinosus, that is a meningeal branch from the mandibular division, and you have this meningeal branches from the maxillary division and the direct branch from the trigeminal ganglion. So these three nerves supply the middle cranial fossa. The posterior cranial fossa is innervated by the upper cervical nerves. So the ascending meningeal branch of the upper cervical nerves, and the meningeal branches of the vagus and the hypoglossal nerve, and you have this ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve. So this is called as a branch from the tentorial nerve, which is a recurrent meningeal branch of ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve, that is the tentorial nerve. So that supplies this tentorium cerebelli. Okay, so these are the nerves that innervate the posterior cranial fossa. So that once again I repeat, the branches, ascending branch, meningeal branch from upper cervical nerves, meningeal branches of the vagus and the hypoglossal nerve, and you have the tentorial nerve, which is a recurrent meningeal branch of ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve. So this nerve is called as tentorial nerve. So that innervates particularly this tentorium cerebelli. Okay, so that's about the nerve supply of this cranial cavity. So dural venous sinuses will be taught in the next session. Thank you.